All right, well, I think we will get started as people still filter in slowly over the next few minutes. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. There's people from all over the world joining us today. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Claudia Schwalis, and I'm the founder and the CEO of DemocracyNext, which is an international research and action institute with a mission of building new institutions for the next democratic paradigm of citizen participation, representation by lot, and deliberation. We are working to shift political and legislative power to everyday people in empowered citizens' assemblies, with the ultimate aim of bringing about a more just, joyful, and collaborative future. So I invite you also to be signing up to our newsletter and following us on social media. We're pretty active in organizing and participating in all sorts of different events, sharing lots of research, developing different tools, hosting events like this one, and really trying to help anyone who are wanting to use sortition and deliberation to democratize decision-making. I'm really delighted to be hosting this double book launch event with two inspiring friends and colleagues, Hugh Pope and Yves Sintomer, and I'm very grateful to James Harding for joining us as a moderator. I'm excited about today because it gives us a really great reason to come together for a rich conversation about sortition, meaning random selection, and its long-spanning history, all the lessons that we can draw from that, and why it's making a comeback today. How we combine it with deliberation in the form of citizens' assemblies, and why this powerful democratic approach can allow us to imagine another democratic future being possible. So in terms of the agenda for today's event, I'll briefly introduce our distinguished presenters and moderator, and then I'm going to pass it over to James Harding to moderate the discussion with the speakers for about half an hour or so. We'll then have 25 minutes of Q&A with those of you who are here in the audience. So please feel free to add any questions in the chat or prepare your questions to come in on video during the second half of the event. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers today. So Hugh Pope is an advocate for democratic renewal through sortition. He sits on the advisory board of DemocracyNext and is a former international correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of books on Turkey, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And he will be discussing his late father's book, The Keys to Democracy, and the vision laid out there for a government entirely based on sortition and deliberation. So, welcome, Hugh. Yves Sintomer is a visiting democracy fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation for the spring semester of 2023. He's a professor of political science at Paris 8 University and associate member of Nuffield College and the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford. And Yves's new book, The Government of Chance, covers the long history of sortition across the world, beyond just ancient Athens, which is the most well-known example. So he argues for a radical democratic imaginary that involves empowering citizens' assemblies beyond the advisory nature that they often have today. And James Harding is the editor and founder of Tortoise Media, a self-described slow news media organization that does more in-depth analysis and coverage. Previously, he was director of BBC News, and prior to that, editor of The Times. So we are in excellent hands for the questioning of our guests today. And without further ado, I pass it over to you, James. Thank you.
Claudia, thank you so much. By the way, I was just thinking to myself, I can think of very few organizations that are committed to outcomes that are both just and joyful, let alone collaborative. So I think it's a very happy thing. If only more organizations had that ambition. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. You know, when you hold these conversations, often you're kind of faking it. You're pretending that you're undecided, but actually you know exactly what you think. The joy of this one is I really don't know what to think. I find myself, when I talk about these things, really swinging between exhilaration at the possibility of something radically different and promising, and despair at the thought that it's never going to happen. And I hope that in the course of the next half hour or so, between Hugh and Yves, you can A, explain to me why I should be exhilarated, and B, banish despair, or at least put it in some context. Yves, I'm going to come to you in a moment, if I might, but I'm going to start with Hugh. Hugh, I don't know whether you or the publisher kindly sent me this book. It must be odd for you because it's a masterpiece of thinking and writing. It's a pleasure to read, and it sort of got lost down the back of the sofa. So do you want, before you tell us what it says, do you want to just tell us a quick history of the book and your father who wrote it?
Well, we all knew that my father was writing it in the 1980s. He was a very busy classicist, and we knew that he was always interested in democracy. And indeed, I read the draft of this book in the 1980s, and to my eternal shame, I, like all his publishers, just laughed and said, Dad, what planet are you on? No one's ever going to do this. And I mean, it includes a utopia, which seemed like an incredibly dated thing in the 1980s. And it was something that we assumed would just be published one day like the rest of my dad's stuff, but it didn't. And in fact, what had happened is it got lost at a publisher's office, and it came back very late, a year or two later. And after that, my father lost interest in it. And after a while, we realized that the book itself had disappeared. And so long before he died in 2019, we thought that it was a lost work, because there was, all we could find was this corrupted computer file, which he thought was the only place it was. But then after his death, my mother found the manuscript in his library, and that led us to today.
And so what did you do? You literally, you sort of typed it out all over again.
At first, yes, and then we found a second draft, but luckily the second draft was amenable to optical recognition software. So it took a little bit of time, but yes, it's the same book. It's a little bit, we've removed words like video cassette has become electronic recording, and telex has become digital communication or something like that. But it's otherwise, it's very much his book. The content we haven't changed. We've left all the stylistic points. It's his voice. There are some footnotes to show where his insights based on 1970s, 80s data is still the case today. So we'll show numbers of jury trials, numbers of statistics about how many people are sick of the current system of electoral democracy. But otherwise, it's the same thing. But we have put in prefaces and afterwards to explain some of the context.
So can we, I appreciate that some people here, not least Yves, but there are people here who are like deeply versed in the language here. But for those people who aren't, sortition, what is it?
Well, it's not, I think there's a couple of things it's not. It's not just choosing a random person to become president, prime minister, or mayor. And it's also very important to remember this is not a replacement of an institution like the House of Lords, as crazily elitist and old-fashioned as it might look in Britain. It's about having a whole new system. I think what Claudia just referred to as a new paradigm. And currently, what's happening in the sortition world mainly are citizens' assemblies. And these are advisory bodies up till now, and they're randomly chosen from a community to come up with ideas. And typically, what makes them very different from the replacement idea is that it's groups of people deliberating, informing themselves, and then making proposals. And it's much more broad-based than the typical party, factional, politician-led system we have in normal life today.
And I'm going to ask Yves about the history of sortition, or the history of democracy by lot in a moment. But one thing, Hugh, that seems to be one of the sort of central argument of Maurice Pope's book is this idea that democracy would almost inevitably lead to oligarchy, that you would have elites in charge, and it seems as though sortition, or democracy by lot, is a check on that inevitable elitism. Will you just explain that trend, that theory, because many people would be struck by the fact that he was writing about that in the 80s, and we're seeing a lot of that in the 2020s.
Yeah, what we look at in the United States almost looks like a plutarchy, doesn't it? And it's very clearly the right analysis. And I think what my father was most worried about was the question of definition, that if over the last 200 years, the idea that elections have become democracy, that is, that the word democracy has been appropriated by the electoral system, or is a bit like a cuckoo in the nest, because it stops you thinking about the real nature of human governance, which ranges actually from tyranny at one end through oligarchies and rules by the few in the middle, and then true democracy at the other end. And if you start saying that democracy actually ends here at oligarchy, you get a situation where people will give up hope in the whole idea of participatory government, because it's not working. As we've seen, it's not delivering. People are very unhappy with the system. And what my father was warning about was that if you have a system where people think that they've got to the end of the democratic spectrum thanks to universal suffrage, which was a noble aim in its day, then when people become dissatisfied, they're going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. They're going to give up with participation. And you can already see it. The polls are showing it. People are upset with the system. They think that democracy is at fault, and they are there are polls showing that people are becoming tempted to secure their economic and political futures through autocracy. I suppose internationally you might call it the Chinese model, but in many ways, people are giving up on the idea of participation because of the failures of the electoral system.
Hugh, I'm going to invite you to kind of weigh in on the things that Yves says, but it seems, Yves, as an outsider, such a kind of radical and anomalous idea, the idea of democracy by lot. Let's randomly select a jury, a panel, an assembly. But my understanding is that your book sets out the fact that this has been actually rather a common thread through history, or at least through the history of democracy. So can you just trace for us a little the sort of the ups and downs of sortition?
I think that, the starting point is today. The fact that most citizens have the feeling that our representatives do not represent us. They are elected, but still we are unsatisfied with what is being done. We have the feeling that they behave much more for their party or their professional career rather than for the common good. And new challenges have emerged in this century. For example, the ecological crisis is here. The next generations do not vote, non-human do not vote, and we have to find ways of getting out of this situation. And one way of improving our democracy could be perhaps sortition. And so the idea was my book was to go back to the past and try to understand why and when so many people had used sortition in the political system. And it's very impressive because during decades, nobody cared about it. So it was not a matter of conversation. And now the historiography has made a lot of progress, and we know that sortition was central in Athens. So the same state which reinvented democracy in the West was using elections, but even more sortition. Then Rome also used sortition widely. It was central in Italian republics. The Italian communes reinvented again politics and the republic. And it was forgotten after the French and American Revolution. And why is it? It has been widespread. It has been mostly used in combination with elections in the Republican and democratic system, but it disappeared at some point. Why is it? And why does it now reappear in a lot of experiments which remain at the margin of the political system? But with an increasing number of exponential growth, that could make it perhaps a legitimate and reasonable solution in the next couple of years.
And Yves, just explain that bit about why it disappeared. Was it the coincidence of greater democratic power, the arrival of the political party, the combination of democratic politics and executive power that meant that, in effect, politicians pushed sortition out of the political system? Because the reason I ask that is, in one sense, if you believe in democracy and you believe in the rule of law, sortition is alive and well. It's in the jury system, and it's there, for years and years and years. So what happened?
The fact that is that it disappeared quite quickly. It has been used during centuries, and within a couple of decades, it disappeared from politics, when at the same time, it was spreading in the jury system. So why was it? There is a common explanation which one hears among activists for sortition, which is it was considered democratic. Elections were considered as more aristocratic. This was said by Aristotle in Athens, but also by Montesquieu and Rousseau before the French Revolution. And this is why it was refused by the founding fathers of the French and the American Revolution. They wanted to select the best through elections, but they wanted some kind of political meritocracy, not democracy. In fact, this explanation is not true. It is not the reason why sortition disappeared. And I think that now we can have ideas relatively clear about this, because there was a huge debate in Switzerland where sortition was used widely, was central until the beginning of the 19th century. It was invaded by French army. So there was a real discussion there. And the main idea is that sortition before the revolution seemed reasonable because it was blind, because there was no difference between the one and the other. So it meant that the competition for power could be regulated through sortition. And power could be shared among a circle which was not very wide in most cases, but it was a peaceful way to solve the conflicts for power. But then, in a couple of decades, sortition was blind, and blind was meaning non-reasonable anymore.
Random. Yeah, yeah.
Because of the Enlightenment, on the one hand, you have to decide. Because of the idea of popular sovereignty and popular will, you have to have a will, you have to decide. You can't rely on chance to select those who will rule or who will advise. And suddenly it appeared completely irrational. In the jury, it was not irrational, because in the juries, the objective was to select a group of pairs. Some people who could judge according to their subjective judgment to decide whether the person was innocent or not.
Yeah.
In politics, politics, there was power struggle, there was facts, there was pluralism. And then why use sortition for designing an assembly which should be plural and not an homogeneous assembly of peers like in the jury system?
And Yves, and Hugh, if you're weighing on this too, I want to come in a moment to the political practicalities of this, but let's just talk for today about a principal issue here, which I think you just touched on, Yves, which is that some people are excited by democracy by lot, and they've looked at examples, what happened in Ireland, what's happened in Taiwan, what's happened in some municipal assemblies, what's happened in cities like Paris, and they say, aha, look, sortition has a practical application. But there is also some, I think, principled opposition to the idea of democracy by lot, which is around the accountability of government, that actually you want your government to execute its power based on rational argument, and that it's accountable for its successes and failures. And there is something about the system of sortition or democracy by lot that makes it harder to ensure that accountability. What do you say to those people who like the idea of it, but on second thoughts think it's not actually accountable?
So you spoke also about a rational discussion. I mean, if you compare a discussion which is going on in a citizen assembly randomly selected and in a normal assembly, elected assembly, I'm pretty sure that most of the people will say that it's more reasonable in a citizen assembly randomly selected.
So Yves, sorry, so Yves, can I just explain to you what I mean by that?
Yeah.
What I think the rational argument is that the arguments around a policy, whether or not it's healthcare or immigration or tax, has progressed through a party, that they have prosecuted and interrogated a set of ideas over time. That's what I meant by rational, not that the people in an assembly or a parliament sound or look rational, but that there's a process.
And then we have to wonder why most citizens, a large majority of citizens in our electoral democracies, have the feeling that representatives are not responsive, are not really accountable. We elect them, but then they do whatever they want. And it's very difficult to push them to respect what most of the people want. Accountability in an assembly randomly selected functions differently. First, the citizens who are selected feel accountable to the authority, to the government, local, national government, who decided to launch the experiment. Second, these citizens feel accountable between each other. It's very clear that when you have such an assembly, if somebody is just defending in a sectarian way his or her view, he or she will be quickly marginalized. You have to demonstrate that you are discussing for the common good. And it's a very strong pressure of the peers, something that you can also see in very different groups. You want to be respected by your comrades, by your friends, by those who are working with you. And the third level of accountability is that these people have the feeling that what they will propose will be looked closely by their fellow citizens. And so they feel accountable of offering the best solution for the problem to their fellow citizens. And through these three ways of being accountable, my claim is that at the end of the day, they are more accountable than elected MPs.
Hugh?
I think that another level you could add, I completely agree with what Yves said, is accountable for what? How can anybody know the future? And I think that my father's book makes a clear difference between a team decision, a small group or organizational decision, and a community decision. And what the sortition-based arrangements ensure is that you're at the community level and you are reacting to a situation that nobody had foreseen. And so it's absolutely true what Yves says. I was attending the French recent Citizens' Assembly on the end of life, on whether France should lift its ban on suicide and assisted suicide and euthanasia. And as Yves says, remarkable sense that the citizens formed very quickly a body accountable to each other, an extraordinary level of mutual respect on a very divisive issue, because some people's faith-based responses, moral responses to euthanasia would be, you cannot kill someone, and that would put them in a minority. But until the end, up till now anyway, this minority has been kept in by the sense that they're being listened to and that they are able to be taken into account. And it's another sense of an accountability is that this is not majoritarian. It's very much a consensus-based. And in France, the French Assembly, for instance, nothing that doesn't get more than 66% of the assembly is accepted. So you have a very strong feeling that what they do agree is very firmly the will of that community based on a very diverse group of people. And just an anecdote on who is accountable or not. At the very first session, we had the president of the French Assemblée Nationale address the citizens. And it quickly became apparent that some of the citizens felt themselves to be as representative as the person who had worked 20 years to become the top person in the Assemblée Nationale. And it became almost an argument, and the president of the French National Assembly said, you have to realize that sortition will never replace elections. And the whole 200 people fell silent. It was like a penny dropping. And everyone suddenly thought, oh gosh, you mean that could happen? And it was a really an electric spark moment.
And Hugh, can I just ask, but that actually gets me to my next question, and I can't work out whether I'm just being contrary or whether I'm right to ask it. Are there to you obvious limits to what democracy by lot, to what sortition, those panels, those juries, those citizens' assemblies can and should work on. I mean, even in this conversation, we've touched on assisted suicide. The Irish case obviously is abortion. Paris citizens' assemblies are doing, really complicated things, investment plans for the city. My natural skepticism is there are some things that sortition just can't do, right? Can an assembly do decision to arm Ukraine or not? Can it make those kinds of military decisions? Can it do long-term tax planning? But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you think sortition can do everything.
Some people think that sortition should be confined to micro issues. And just by pure chance, as it happens, my wife was elected here in Brussels to a local citizens' assembly deciding on trees in streets and flower pots and things. And it turns out that that is a really bad use of people's time. What you need is a really, what in the sortition community they call a wicked problem for a community as a whole to address. And I think it's quite obvious that a municipality is best placed to decide where trees and flowers actually go in streets, and a community decision-making mechanism like a sortition a citizens' assembly for, say, the whole of Brussels would decide what proportion of the streets need to be green and so forth. So the criteria and the moral policy can be done by the whole community, but the execution of it should be done by professional organizations that are perhaps accountable one day to sortitional assemblies, who knows, but for actual the mechanical carrying out of policy, I think you just need the normal organizations.
Yves?
I would add that can everything be made with elections? No. You have to have experts committees, and civil servants. You have to have a vibrant civil society. Direct democracy, citizens' initiatives are quite important for democracy and are also becoming more legitimate at the time being. And I would say the same for sortition. I think this is one potential pillar for democratization of our democracy, but one among others. I think, for example, that a vibrant civil society, social movements are crucial to democratic renewal. And they are not the same. I mean, on the one hand, you have people organizing, you have people knowing each other and building in the middle run and the long run, building ties between each other. Sortition is something different. People meet, they don't know each other, they meet for a certain amount of time, and they can propose or eventually decide on a specific issue. So you have to have different pillars. I think elections remain important, but we could have another assembly which would be randomly selected. We could have, like in Ireland, there was a citizen assembly proposing same-sex marriage, and a couple of years later, abortion. Then it was discussed by the elected assembly and then decided by the people at large. I think that this kind of movement should be implemented.
And Yves, do you think that, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that people are more likely to come to sortition if they feel as though it's part of the blended democratic model. But that gets me to sort of the political practicalities of this. One is what you might think of as the vested interests, but the political parties and the existing system and the suspicion of change. And the other is, if you like, the presentational problem of sortition. That, as you say, you talk about random, you talk about chance, you talk about by lot. People will be naturally nervous about a system of government, execution of power, that seems unpredictable, random, open to chance. How do people like you and Hugh and Claudia and people who want to reform democracy actually make it happen?
I think that one has to develop the argument that unpredictable is not the good word, impartial or more impartial is the good word, and more democratic, because then you will have people like you and me like everybody, a representative sample of the people, a fair cross-section of the community, as the US Supreme Court wrote, who will decide with a much wider discussion than the discussion which is made usually by elected politicians. How could this happen? Well, first of all, with the huge legitimacy crisis that we experience at the time being, there can be a push from, say, citizens to experiment. And I think that some politicians, some political parties could realize that sharing power would give them more legitimacy. No, it's not that easy to be a politician. I mean, you go in the streets and you said you are a French representative at the time being in the French streets. It's not very pleasant. And I think that giving more dynamism to the system, giving more legitimacy to the system could be something for everybody. The philosopher Hannah Arendt said once that sharing power allows to have more power. And I think that some politicians could at least understand this.
Hugh, can I, sorry, you wanted to jump in, yeah.
No, there's just in Brussels, the president of the French-speaking parliament here actively says she is sharing power exactly as Yves described in order to avoid losing completely the respect of her electorate, because she really feels a danger that the voters are so alienated that they may not be able to recover their position. So she is bringing randomly selected citizens into her parliamentary subcommittees, for instance, in order to enrich the debate there and re-engage with citizenry. I think it's a really important development.
Yves, can I just ask you one thing? In the history of sortition that you've written, sorry, do you find that democracy by lot, these randomly selected panels or assemblies, act as a check on arbitrary power or the misuse of executive power, or do they act as an enabler of decision-making? And the reason I'm asking you is there's this critique at the moment of democracy that you look at autocracies and they're making the big decisions that need to be made about, reforming energy systems to address the climate challenge. But we in the West, and I'm saying we, but many countries will feel this way, actually are suffering from the indecisiveness of democracy, the short-termism of democracy, and that sortition could make that matter worse, add to indecision rather than help make decisions.
I mean, in the history, it's quite clear that sortition was widely used when these political communities were the most efficient. This is true for classical Athens. This is true for the wonderful period of Italian communes. This is true for the so-called golden century in Spain. This is true for Switzerland before the revolution. This was also true for the Chinese Empire during 3 centuries when China was the most powerful country in the world. And for now, look at what happened with the French Citizen Assembly for the Climate. The different governments from the left, from the center, from the right, and have not been able to decide a credible plan to respect what France has promised to do against global warming. And the Citizen Assembly for the Climate, which met during around 1 year, a bit less, was able to propose a very ambitious plan, which was not perfect, but which was much more ambitious than any government's plannings in the past. Then the government has not followed this, and 1 year later, with the energy crisis, with the Ukraine war, is obliged to go much forward. So I think that in the situation in which we are now, it is much probable that citizen assemblies would allow us to go much quicker and to be more ambitious than ordinary electoral politics.
Yves, thank you. I'm going to hand back to Claudia in one moment. I just want one final thought from Hugh, if I might. which is you talk about wicked problems, right? And actually, I think the thing that's most interesting about the world today is we've got a lot of those. In one particular area, they seem to have become much more polarizing, and I'm talking about cultural disagreements, what's kind of commonly called culture wars. And it's quite interesting that sortition or citizens' assemblies have really engaged with some of the most difficult issues, abortion-assisted dying. Why is it, do you think, that citizens' assemblies have managed to negotiate, think through and answer on those problems when elected politicians have found that more polarizing and more difficult?
Well, the first part of the answer, I think, is the question of where does polarization come from? And it's both ends of the political spectrum feeling that the government isn't listening to them. So there's a certain shared attitude from people on the left and on the right, or pro-Trump or anti-Trump, where they, in many communities, the polarization is a symptom rather than a cause. And in terms of how citizens' assemblies overcome this, I think I'd like to go back to this whole idea of randomness, which Yves slightly alluded to as well, but the benefits of randomness in it's seen as fair, it's seen as empowering. And I could see on the first day of that French Citizens' Assembly that people felt very honored to be chosen to represent themselves in this assembly. And it gave them an enormous amount of power that they weren't there because they were women, they weren't there because they were poor or rich or whatever, or because they were educated. They were just there because they were themselves. Yeah. And it allowed them to treat each other with an enormous amount of respect. And another thing that happens when you do that is, which amazes me that my father, in his book, manages to point out from his library in North Oxford, is that it creates a zest, a fruitful energy among people that overcomes these divisions. People move towards the center, and you can see it happening with the votes. You can see the silent majority emerging, and it's an immensely empowering feeling. And I think that you talked about randomness being a bad thing, but remember that even in science, you have things that you need randomness. So if you're polishing a mirror for a telescope, it needs to be randomly polished, otherwise it'll give a false positive. In medicine, for arteries, you need to have randomly patterned fibers, artificial fibers, to line arteries, otherwise you'll get wave patterns which will go against you. And for the reproduction of species in biology, you need fully random breeding, otherwise you will not perpetuate the species. So it's not as if it's unscientific to be random. It can be very scientific to be random.
Okay, Hugh, thank you. I'm going to hand back to Claudia. And before I do, Claudia, I'm just going to say, because you're going to be too modest to say it, but actually Claudia wrote a paper at the OECD, which is quietly in the process of making the OECD quite cool, which, let's face it, people never thought they would say. But the OECD did this report on catching the deliberative wave. I know you're part of a team, Claudia, that did it. But it's actually really, if you go on the website, it's really worth reading because it gives quite a big perspective on the whole thing. And Yves, you were saying before we got on the call, if the OECD is getting tucked into it, we know it's real. So Claudia, over to you.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, James. I just popped the link over to that OECD work in the chat as well, because it's true that for those less familiar with these ideas and so on, it might seem sort of new, or we're talking about these historical examples, but with the work we did at the OECD, there's now almost 600 contemporary examples of these assemblies that have been documented that we've looked into. So this is not just some one-off thing that is happening here or there, but has actually been proliferating and in this deliberative wave, so on. So really rich to hear from Hugh and Yves. And we also wanted to invite in questions from those of you who are curious about this and who have joined us here today. So please feel free to raise your virtual hands. We're enabling people to come on video if you want to take a little bit of time for your questions, or you can pop them in the chat. I see one question already coming in about sortition and liquid democracy being compatible, and factors around trust and expertise. So I will allow one of you to come in on that. I also want to perhaps sort of benefit from being a bit of a moderator here to bring in one question that for me is really interesting, which is that I think sometimes we think of at least the history of sortition being something very Western, and we talk a lot about ancient Athens, and that's one of the most common examples. But I thought what was interesting with your work, Yves, in particular, was that there are also lots of historical examples in many parts of the world, and I would love for you to maybe bring up at least one or two of them just to give us a wider sense of this actual global application of these ideas. So maybe we start with that and we allow people to warm up and think of their questions in the meantime as well. So perhaps Yves, I can.
Well, for the question of what about the global south, or at least outside the West, I can give 3 examples. Anthropologists have shown that in India, in the ethnic communities of northeast India, sortition was widely used in the villages to choose the leader of the village, who was a weak leader during a year, and then sortition was used again and again to share the power within the community. Another example, I've mentioned it, Imperial China, as you probably know, had a state exam to hire the highest civil servants. And when they have got the examination, then they were put in each provinces through sortition. So it was to choose a selected group of brilliant scholars and civil servants where they will act. A last example, which is a contemporary one, is in Mexico at the time being, the party of the president, which is called Morena, and the president is called López Obrador, used sortition together with elections. At the bottom, the activists of Morena made shortlists of people they trust to be candidate in the elections. Then there is a lottery to decide among these people who will be the candidate of the party in the elections, and then there are elections. And in fact, a lot of deputies, both at national, at federal and state level and communal level, have been chosen this way, and research shows that it's more success for the party. It is an opening to people, I mean, community leaders coming from the grassroots instead of old politicians having the power since a lot of time. And it has improved also the discussion within the party. So it's an interesting example.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you. I'm somewhat familiar with some of them, but I still need to read fully all of your book to look into more of these, because I think it's important that we don't see this as something that's only possible or relevant for some parts of the world as well. And there's deep histories also, I think, of deliberation as well as sortition too. I'm seeing that there's more and more questions coming up, so I'm going to not necessarily take them in order, and some of them have some relevant threads. So perhaps to you, Hugh, I wanted you to pick up on something that I think you were already alluding to in some of your earlier responses about, you know, is sortition something that is actually something of a stepping stone towards real ongoing participation where citizens are always more involved and proposing and active in other ways? And I think this to me ties into this question of, you know, does this activate some sort of agency in the people who are selected for these assemblies?
Certainly in France, the 150 people chosen for the climate assembly famously have become very active as a result of the initiation into the discussion of a very precise policy area, the climate change. And I think the figure is of 20 or 30 of them, right, Yves, who have now gone into politics at some level as activists, having not necessarily been that engaged before. So it shows that being given the chance to be politically active makes people much more engaged. And the first step towards apathy and alienation is obviously that sense of never being able to do anything. So in that sense, if you had a system that, for instance, my father is recommending, where you move as an ideal in, say, 100, 200 years' time, you reach a system where the whole of government is on a sortition basis, you would be spending a week or 2 weeks a year as a normal citizen with your children looked after, paid for, leave from work, and you would go and you would be practiced at being a policy setter at various levels of government. And then, yes, I think it is a stepping stone. There are stepping stones towards that, but of course, there's the countervailing tendency towards autocracy, which we've always had in human nature, and I think it'll always be a struggle.
Indeed. Well, I guess on this point, because there's a few thumbs up around it as well, I'm going to pick on the question that Patrick has put in the chat about how do you think we could actually get from our current political multi-crises in this world to one where deliberative processes, sortition-based assemblies are actually the norm and are not just the exception. And I know that Yves, even though your book is also historical in nature, actually it's also very forward-looking and exploring this future question. So what do you think about this?
I mean, let me give one example. In 2007, the French Socialist Party candidate for the presidential elections was Ségolène Royal. And I'm not sure she was convinced, but she had the flair and saw that this could be something interesting. And in her program, she had put the creation of citizens mini publics, citizen juries, and wanted to reform the French constitution in order to do this. She has not won the election, but it was quite possible. And I think that this could be something more than an exception. You could find politicians saying, in order to get credibility, I have to propose huge changes. And among these, among these changes, sortition could be one way of improving the political trust, which is very low now. So if you put, say, Extinction Rebellion as one of its four claims, the creation of a citizen assembly, and politicians like Ségolène Royal, then you could have a convergence of various actors introducing something ambitious.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I see that Hugh, you want to come in on this. I'm going to abuse my role as moderator and just kind of also respond a little bit and tie in a bit of the work that we're doing too, because I completely agree with you. But I also think that the examples you're mentioning now give an impression that this is maybe just some sort of left-wing movement as well. And actually what's been interesting to see is that there has been initiatives and support and introduction of these ideas across the political spectrum, that this is not some sort of partisan effort. And actually the first place in the world that has set up a permanent citizens council, which functions alongside the elected parliament, which is in Ostbelgien, the German-speaking region of Belgium. That was at the initiative of two different politicians, the president of the parliament and the president of the government, from two different centre-right parties. And then there was a unanimous vote across party lines in the parliament to set up the legal basis for this new institution. And I just wanted to highlight this fact that actually, I think this is something that's enabling us to overcome some of those traditional partisan divides as well. And I now let you come back in on what he was wanting to say as well.
I was just going to say that obviously nothing's going to happen overnight, and the logarithmic expansion of the use and experimentation with citizens' assemblies is obviously very encouraging. But we look at the British Parliament, which existed for hundreds of years before it actually became a central instrument, and even when it began becoming a central instrument of the power setup, only 10 or 15% of its members were elected, and it took from the moment it became a real player, it took another 150 years until you got universal suffrage. So these things can take time. I think the point is to build up credibility, to show that it works, and to find out what it's best at and what it's not useful for, and not to rush in and be revolutionary about it, but definitely to evolve things. In Germany, for instance, they have a very interesting experiment, which is to take citizens' assemblies based on constituency districts to support the elected politician with advice about what the constituents are thinking about certain issues, which apparently the politicians find extremely valuable, because normally they don't have such constructive interactions with their constituents.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I think your point about evolution is right. I mean, there's still many countries that have a monarchy and the parliament in place. And so you can see how this coexistence of different institutions together evolving makes a lot of sense. I'm going to call on Oliver, who has his hand up, if you'd like to come on video to ask your question.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yeah, I guess my question is about the other side of the equation. We've been talking a lot about what sortition can do to improve legitimacy. I'm interested in what sortition can do to improve capacity to act on complex issues. And I think sortition is going to play a crucial role in the years to come. But I don't know how far it can take us, because we're placing a lot of emphasis on the input side of the equation. If only we just make better decisions, if only we just have bodies that have the capacity to deal with wicked issues according to deliberative standards. But then there's the other side, which is implementation, bureaucracy, public administration, policy work, right? And that's where things get really complicated. So I'm interested to hear what Yves and Hugh might want to say about that side, because that's the side where even well-functioning, and there are not many, but well-functioning electoral democracies struggle on that one as well. So how is a sortition-based system going to allow us to act on complex issues with collective capacity? And that's the bit where I'm not fully all the way sort of invested in a full sortition-based process, the capacity side, not just the legitimacy, but the capacity side.
Thank you, Oliver. Does one of you want to come in particular on this? Mm-hmm.
I think Yves already answered that problem, Pablo. In the sense that there have been incredibly successful historical examples. I mean, ancient Athens is probably arguably one of the most successful civilizations, certainly for its size, and it saw that its success was founded on its political system. And I think in terms of capacity, bureaucracy's main complaints are that the decisions they're getting from the political system are clearly based on corruption, nepotism, and other mistakes that the electoral system keeps pushing up, and which having things chosen randomly, having the people chosen randomly, offers a great new chance to cut out this kind of problem. And it remains to be seen, but sortition-based systems do not cut out the bureaucracy. I think that they would, certainly in my father's book, the idea is that the Citizens' Assembly hands over the power to implement a policy to a director, and then reviews it in a year's time, and if that by another panel, and if that panel decides the director is doing a good job, it gets reappointed. So I think that there's every reason to believe that a sortition-based system can be very efficient.
But still, I mean, again, sortition is not sufficient in itself. You still need a public, well-organized and responsive bureaucracy with civil servants reactive to the people, open to participation of the people to enact and implement what has been decided. And sortition could be used to form panels assessing what civil servants are doing. I mean, in Athens, there were civil servants. There were a lot of civil servants, but most of them were public slaves, so that they had no power at least political power. No, we don't have any public slaves anymore, but we could have citizen juries assessing, evaluating what the administration is doing. And at this level, I think it could improve what the public servants are doing.
Yeah, and I think, well, from my perspective, it's also not an either or. Like, I think that the issue that Oliver is raising about the capacity to implement is a legitimate one, and that needs to be addressed. But I don't see that that necessarily actually detracts from some of the arguments for sortition on that political decision-making side of the issue. I'm conscious that we are kind of getting close to the end of the hour, and there's been a few different disparate questions. I kind of want to end with asking each of you to reflect on kind of what is it that gives you the most hope about the future of democracy, and perhaps that and one thing that you would encourage the people who are here with us to do if they are interested to know more about this, to do something. What would be one thing you would suggest to people? So maybe Hugh first and then Yves.
Well, for me, I couldn't believe how empowering it was to stand in front of 185 randomly selected French people in the middle of Paris and feel that I was looking at France. And they came from all over both mainland France and its external territories. And they also felt that. And there was a sense of motivation and what some social scientists call very scientifically best behavior. It was people determined to do their civic duty, and that gave me such hope that there was this real capacity in human beings to cooperate for the best of the common interest of society. And I think that in terms of reproducing that, I don't know, being randomly selected is not something you can aim to do, but I think I've learned so much from reading books like those of Yves and Brett Hennig and David van Reybrouck and Helen Landemore. That there are wonderful authors out there who can really give a new opening, as opposed to this kind of sterile discussion of which politician can replace another politician, when you know it's the system that's broken, and that's what we need to replace.
And I would say experiment randomly selected bodies, because you will be convinced of the interest of this process, because you will also convince others that this is an interesting way for making democracy work better than it works now. Because also you will know better the limits and the challenges which are at stake. And also because we have no magic formula. I mean, it is through the experiments that will make step forward. There is no one perfect solution. The solution will come from the experiment, from the experience, from confronting what is being done there and there, what has worked and what has not worked, and this make it possible then for scholars to reflect on it, to make it possible for activists to reflect on it. But we have to experiment, and this is wide open.
Yeah, I appreciate that actually, and that really, even though you didn't mention it directly, but what gives it connects to this idea of hope, which I think means that there is an uncertainty about the future, and because of that, we need to just act, and we need to do things, and we need to try things, and then learn from them, and try and do things differently. So I also put into the chat just now a few links to like our different DemocracyNext newsletter and website and other things, and if you are interested, we are also just sharing different resources if you're wanting to try these ideas in your organization. It doesn't have to be with the government, and also sharing research of people like Yves and Hugh and many others. And perhaps as a final wrap up, I also want to bring James back in, because you opened up by saying that, you know, you were genuinely wanting to find out more. You don't have a clear position on this. I'm not asking you if you have a position, but just maybe one thing that you have kind of taken away or have come away from this discussion as well.
Well, firstly, I love the book. So actually, the thrill of it is finding an argument and I should say, sorry, I've read The Keys to Democracy, the Maurice Pope book. Hugh and I met many years ago, and there's something very romantic about a book that sort of not only foresees where we end up, but has an answer too. But the thing that I'm really interested in was Yves' point around sortition as one of the pillars of democracy, i.e. not a check on elected democracy, but a complement to it. And I think if it's pitched in that way, juries, panels, assemblies that provide a different locus of power seem to me to be a very healthy and invigorating thing for democracy.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I also encourage everyone to buy and to read the two books by Yves Sintomer and Maurice Pope. Thank you very much to Hugh, Yves, and James for your participation, and thank you to everyone who came along this evening. This has been really, really rich, and to be continued all of these conversations. So thank you very much, and yeah.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.